Now, some of you might remember that way back before the summer holidays, we left Joseph in the land of Egypt, where Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, had put Joseph in charge. And you may also remember that there had been a famine, which means that the crops didn't grow in the fields. And Joseph had helped save everyone in Egypt from the famine by storing plenty of grain beforehand so that during the famine everybody had enough to eat. But not only that, Joseph's father, Jacob, and his 11 brothers and their families and all their animals, their camels and sheep and donkeys and even their cows, had all come to Egypt, and they had all been saved from the famine, and all because of Joseph. Well, Joseph's family settled in Egypt, and they lived there very happily for many years, and more children were born and grew up. And then they had more children who grew up. And then they had more children who grew up. And this went on until they became a huge family. And some of you may also remember that God had made a promise to Joseph's great-great-grandfather. Many years beforehand, Father Abraham had been promised that he would be the first of a very big family, God's special people, the Israelites. So you see, that had come true. But they weren't living in the special land of Israel, the land that God had given them at this time. They were still living in the land of Egypt. Well, eventually, after 400 years had passed, there were more than 600,000 Israelites living in the land of Egypt. Now that is a lot of people. And that brings us to today's story. Now, of course, after 400 years, Jacob and Joseph and all of that generation and all of the animals had all passed away. And so had that Pharaoh. And of course, Father Abraham had passed away many years before that. And now there was a new king or Pharaoh living in Egypt. Now, this new Pharaoh, he didn't know anything about Joseph, but he did know that there were an awful lot of Israelites living in the land of Egypt. And he wasn't too happy about that. You see, the Israelites were big and strong, and the new Pharaoh was a little bit scared of them. So he called some of his men to him. And he said, "You know what? There's just too many of these Israelites here. I mean, what about if war breaks out? They might join our enemies and then fight against us. We are going to have to use them as slaves and work them very hard." So Pharaoh commanded that new cities be built in Egypt, and the Israelite men were forced to build them with bricks. They were given plenty of bricks. And Pharaoh's men watched over them, and they became slave drivers. So all day long, they stood and watched the Israelite men working, building new cities in Egypt. Come along, faster! You're not working hard enough. Get on with it. So all day long in the hot sun, the Israelite men were building cities in Egypt, and all day long Pharaoh's men were slave driving them. But you see, what happened was, because of all that hard work, the Israelite men just got stronger and stronger. And the Israelite women were still having more babies, so there were even more Israelites. And then Pharaoh thought, these Israelite men are very strong. We really don't want any more of them. We need to stop the Israelite women from having any more boy babies, because they grow up to be Israelite men. And then Pharaoh did something very bad indeed. He called the midwives. Call the midwives! Call the midwives! Here we are, we're the midwives. Now, the midwives are the nurses who help ladies when they are having babies. And this is what Pharaoh said to the midwives. He said, when you are helping the Israelite ladies to have their babies, if the baby is a boy, kill it. But if it is a girl, let it live. Well, what a terrible thing to do. But fortunately, the midwives did not obey Pharaoh. They knew that Pharaoh had asked them to do a terrible thing, and they trusted God, so they didn't kill the boy babies. They trusted God, and because they trusted God, God gave them families of their own. But Pharaoh was very angry. I am very angry indeed. And then he came up with another evil plan. He called his people. Now, listen to me. Every Israelite baby boy that is born, you must throw into the river Nile. But let the girls live. Well, what a terrible thing to do. Now, there was a young Israelite couple living in Egypt at that time, and they had a daughter called Miriam. And Miriam's mother was going to have a baby. And when the baby was born, it was a baby boy. And when the baby's mother looked at him, she knew that he was special and that he would grow up and have an important job to do for God. So she kept him hidden in the house for 3 months. But after 3 months, she realised that he was getting bigger and it was harder to hide him. So she got a basket and she covered it with tar and pitch to make it waterproof. And she placed the baby inside the basket and closed the lid. And then she took the basket to the river Nile and she put it onto the river and watched it float gently down the river Nile. Then she went and asked her daughter, Miriam, go and watch the basket, watch from a distance and see what happened. So Miriam went to the river and she watched the basket. Well, the princess, Pharaoh's daughter, came down to the river Nile to bathe and she saw the basket. So she sent one of her servants to fetch it and she looked inside. And she looked inside and she saw the baby, and the baby was crying, and the princess felt sorry for the baby. She lifted him out and she liked him. and she decided that she wanted to keep him for herself. Now Miriam was watching, and she had a really good idea. She approached the princess. "Shall I fetch one of the Israelite women to come and look after the baby for you?" "Oh, yes, please," said the princess. So Miriam ran home and fetched her mother and brought her to the princess. "I found this baby," she said. "Would you look after him for me until he's old enough to come and live in the palace with me, and I will pay you?" So the baby went home with his mother and was looked after until he was old enough to go and live in the palace with the princess and become the son of the princess. And the princess named him Moses, which means "I drew him out of the water." Now you see, God's people, the Israelites, were being treated very badly as slaves in Egypt. But God has a plan. Even when things look very bad, God always has a plan. Moses was the one chosen by God to save his people from the Egyptians and take them back to the land of Israel. And that is why he was kept safe when he was a baby. It is also why he ended up living in the Egyptian palace, where he grew up with the princess and learned the Egyptian language and the Egyptian ways. You see, it was all part of God's plan. And we will find out more about what Moses did when he grew up next time. But now it's time to make our craft to help us remember this week's story and to help us to tell it to other people.